Hi everyone. Today we're going to take a quick look at votive statuary during the early dynastic period in Mesopotamia. The early dynastic period is one of the earliest historical periods that are defined for Mesopotamia and runs roughly from 2900 to 2350 BCE. The period is characterized by the emergence of ruling dynasties in several different cities. So votive statuary for Mesopotamia are statues of worshippers that were placed in a temple complex, and they're found in quite large quantities in archaeological contexts. The biggest hoards have been found in Eshnunna, Mari and Nippur, which are sites spread quite widely over the Mesopotamian region. They're found, as I said, within temple sanctuaries, also at entrance points to temples, as well as being buried in caches in temple grounds. While they're found in very different locations, spread quite widely through Mesopotamian geography, they all have very similar features, which suggests a unity of religious belief and ritual practice that we might not expect from a region which is characterized by lots of different small city-states. It's not one massive empire at this point. It's lots of little cities that have their own beliefs but also seem to coincide with each other quite substantially. So these statues all have the same basic posture and basic shape. They're less than life-size depictions of humans. They have their hands clasped at their waists, their faces turned up, and their eyes stare straight ahead. Individual traits are also shown through physical characteristics, but also through inscriptions. A lot of these statues are inscribed somewhere on their body with the name of the person who dedicated the statue, the god to whom it's dedicated, and maybe a request for a prayer. They represent people from all different backgrounds. Later in Mesopotamian history, most of the statues set up in temples are restricted to depictions of the gods and the king. You don't get a lot of private individuals dedicating statues much after the early dynastic period, but in this period we have all kinds of people, including musicians, as well as scribes and just lots of different people. It's really cool. The reason that these statues are set up has been argued to be related to an issue of a lack of access to Mesopotamian temples and the divine. While in the early dynastic period the temples were incredibly powerful and spread really throughout the whole region, common people had very little access to them. It's very unlikely that your average person would be allowed to go much past the entrance gates to a temple. They probably would not have been allowed into what we call the sanctuary, which is where the cult statue of the deity was placed. So because they had no direct access to the state gods, people, we think, would commission these statues and then dedicate them at the temple so that the statues could act as an intermediary for them, between them and the god. So it's kind of a communicative purpose. The statues were set up within the temple sanctuary, we think along benches that were placed against the walls, and were intended to communicate with the deity and just represent the worshipper in a very physical sense at a time when you couldn't physically worship your god in the temple. Because of this, the large staring eyes that are characteristic of the statues have been interpreted as a channel of communication. There's a great article that I'll put a reference to in the description on this, but the idea is that the eyes would kind of provide some kind of two-way connection between the statue of the worshipper and the statue of the god. And statues could also receive offerings themselves, especially if they were set up kind of in the temple courtyard in a more publicly accessible place. And interestingly, when these statues were no longer required, when they were decommissioned, they were usually buried beneath the temple floor. So instead of being destroyed or tossed out in the garbage, it seems that they were far too important or maybe sacred to really leave the temple complex. They were part of the temple's property, part of the property of the god because of that. So they had to stay on the temple property, so they were buried underneath the floor.